Hey guys, so today on my stream I decided to do something a little bit different and spent almost the entire stream just talking about sort of like game design and how we should be thinking about, Runeterra's position in it. Stuff like, why or, what exactly are the problems with this meta? What exactly are the problems with some of the things people complain about, like elusives and Heimer, and what kind of like, most importantly, what the best solutions to these kinds of things are. It ended up being like incredibly long. I covered a ton of topics in these 5 hours in regards to game design. I can't help it. If you've watched this channel for a while, you know that this happens every once in a while. Because game design is a really big passion of mine. But I think that, a lot of people were actually, a surprising amount of people on my Twitch stream were very interested in the discussion. And I think you guys will be too, because there's really a lot to break down here. And a lot that you will learn. There will be a lot that will definitely surprise you. Elusives. One thing that can interact with them is other elusives. This has been a problem from day one. Heimerdinger power level increases exponentially with new spells. Heimer turrets being elusive exacerbates the problem. Balance issues. Certain cards being individually strong has been a constant problem. Demacia as a region has always been hard carried by overpowered cards. Burn was fine until it got pushed over the edge in Rising Tides. And all new Bagels is going to continue saying more. I didn't actually know Bagel still played this game. I thought I was out. Maybe he is. Okay, let me move my camera since we're on Twitter. Okay. This is going to be kind of interesting. I am at this point in time going to talk about Heimer for probably not that long. Although I always think these things aren't going to be that long, and then I always branch out into like 3 or 4 subpoints. Okay, let's talk about Heimer. I don't think this is going to be that. How could I possibly make this take that long? Heimerdinger, okay? I don't like Heimerdinger as a card. I think Heimerdinger should be honestly reworked, to be honest. Now, there's a lot of people that feel Heimer is fine and the culprit is Flash. This is a common sentiment, and to some degree it is true. There are bits of this that's true. If you nerfed Flash, the Heimer deck would get nerfed and would cease to be a big problem. That is true. I agree with that. However, that's not the objective. That's not the point. The point isn't to do anything we can to make Heimer not tier 1. That's not what we're looking for. There's a lot of ways to do that. And yeah, I don't think he'd be tier 1, but here's the problem with Heimer. Heimer is by far the most polarizing card in the entire game. Like, by far. Like, it's not even close. Like, it's really, 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 really not even close. Heimerdinger effectively turns the entire game into his own mini game of, well, in the worst cases, go fish, forcing them to have an answer or they lose. And you know what? That's not really going to change that much if they change a lot of these constituent cards. Like, let's say they deleted Flash, or let's say they made Heimer's elusive unit not elusive. Maybe they just don't give him elusive. Those would stop him from being tier 1, but they wouldn't reduce the entire game into a mini game. They would still reduce his entire being into a mini game. And that's bad. Riot loves mini games. And you know what? I love mini games too. Mini games in card games are fucking great. And you can do so much with them. Quests in Hearthstone there were some mishaps, but for the most part, they did pretty good things, right? That's great. And you know what? Every single champion level up is a mini game, and that's kind of the point. That's the entire point of champions. And I love that fundamental design of champion. That's great. That's amazing. Here's the difference. Heimer turns the entire game into a mini game. Heimer says if you win the mini game, you win, and if you lose the mini game, you lose. Because let's be honest, if you play a 5-mana 1/3, you lose. And that's a problem. Minigames are great when that's not the entire 15-minute experience that you're playing, right? When they actually have an impact but aren't completely dictating the game. Fiora. Fiora, I think, is a lot more fine. I think that's a conversation for another day. I can explain why Fiora ends up being a lot more fine. Okay, I'll explain right now. Pretty simple. Fiora's mostly more fine just because the opponent has many opportunities to deal with it. Like every deck has fundamental ways of dealing with Fiora. Some are better than others, don't get me wrong, but it's something that is like much less of a go fish thing. It can sometimes boil down to go fish, and sometimes you'll lose to Fiora off of a bad hand, but it's just not really the same thing. Okay. So, here's the thing. Too polarizing. Like, let's talk about polarization. Okay? Polarizing means, because I've mentioned this so many times, but we haven't really quite listed examples or defined it. So polarization is just high range between floor and ceiling for value. Is pretty much what this means. There's if we want to be technical like smartasses, there's a big asterisk here, which is that like the commonality of the range is important, because in theory there's some cards that are mostly pretty consistent value, but in like 0.5% of cases they have like a ridiculously low floor, and I wouldn't call that polarizing. So to add an additional definition, common swings in that value. They don't even have to be hyper common, just common enough that you see them, right? Okay. Polarizing cards. Standalone. It's a card that if you top deck it later in the game, absolutely useless, but it can be super OP at the start of the game, right? Allegiance cards. These cards are polarizing not actually because of the proc rate, but because of the draw rate. It turns the game into like, if I draw 2 allegiances, I'm 66% favored. If I draw 0, I'm like 40. And that's a really big swing range. Those are really common situations. So like all the allegiance cards are kind of like that. They're kind of polarizing, What do you guys think? What are some other polarizing cards? Nab? Yeah, a lot of combo pieces. I would say Nab. What I would say is that in the same way that people misattribute Allegiance's polarization to the procs as opposed to the draws, I would also very much say that people misattribute Nab's polarizations to the draws as opposed to the combo pieces. Nab's truly polarizing because of the hand states where you're on double merchant goods, not really because of what you draw from it. Although, yes, that is a factor. Yes, that is a factor. But it's mostly just because of those hand states. So, and that we can get into a whole like combo pieces, right? Nab is a good example of a combo piece that's polarizing. Then there's stuff like Keeper Butcher, and potentially stuff like Crimson Disciple, right? These are all somewhat polarizing cards. Now, here's the thing. Not all of these are necessarily negative. And it's not as if, again, I'm going to keep saying it, balance in all things. It's not as if that some swings aren't good. You can't have every card being consistent value. That's terrible. That's even worse. But you want to limit the range and frequency of these swings. And nothing is even close to the level of Heimerdinger. Like, he's the polarization mega king. Like, not even close. Harrowing's not bad. Yeah, we should list like big cards like that, Harrowing, even Ruination. Let's say Ruination. Why not? That's totally fine. These are technically polarizing, but I don't think I view either of these as like negative in any way. Like Ruination is polarizing, but in a pretty great way. I think Ruination is kind of perfectly balanced. It adds a ton of tension to the game. You have to set it up. You can play around it, and there's many different ways to play around it. It's not like overly complex. It's not an auto in any deck. Some decks can choose to opt to cut it. This is a great example of like a card that is polarizing in a great way. And yeah, sometimes it's going to be bad and sometimes it's going to be good. But for the most part, it's something that, because it kind of like exists in the late game and because there's a bit more control over it, feels totally fine. Totally fine. I love Ruination. I love this card's impact on like the meta, the deck building, the play patterns. I don't even think it's a great card, honestly. Like when I run Shadow Isles decks, I run one Ruination at most. I don't run a ton of this card, but just on in terms of what it does, it's great. Judgment, fantastic card. I kind of wish Judgment was a bit more competitive, but by its own design, it kind of can't be. Judgment's also a phenomenally designed card. Great at teaching players new things. Amazing teaching experience, judgment. Too much polarization is bad. Heimerdinger is too polarized. And therefore, fundamentally, unbalanceable. We're going back to balanced versus balanceable. Completely different concepts, and they should be treated as such. Heimer isn't a balanced card right now. That's not the problem. Basically, the problem is he's not a balanceable card. You could like gut flash, or you could make his things not elusive, or you could fundamentally change the elusive keyword. And all of those would stop Heimer from being tier 1. But this card in his current design is too polarized to really exist as a greatly balanceable card. Do you really believe that he will be as polarizing after a flash nerf? Yes. If you kill Heimer, you have not won the game, but I mean your opponent spent 5 mana doing nothing, and if you don't kill Heimer, then you've basically lost the game. I think that I'm not saying he needs to be like fully redesigned per se, but some kind of tweak. Because the thing is, yeah, we can nerf him, but it's just going to be too hard to get him just right in his form. I don't like reducing the entire game to a minigame like that, right? Like, in his current form, he'll either just be too weak or too strong. Like, yeah, we nerf Flash, maybe we nerf Elusive, and then he'll be out of the meta, and we'll be happy for a while. But A, he'll be back eventually. And B, more importantly, fuck A. Who gives a shit about A? More importantly, why do we have bad cards in our card pool? The objective isn't to delete things from being tier 1. If we do that, then we don't even end up with a game after that. If we can't just keep doing that, right? So it's not about kicking him from tier 1. It's not about trying to make him balanced, but balanceable, right? Because until he's balanceable, he can't be balanced. He will either always be too weak or too good, depending on A, his support cards in the pool, and B, the meta, in that order. And there's many ways you can explore it, you know? There's a lot you could do. You could sort of like in some way alter his level up minigame and payoff. To be honest, he has kind of like a really sort of like lame like level up concept. You could make it generate like 1 turret per turn. I don't know. That's kind of like the laziest one. That if you want to rein in polarization, that's like the first thing that comes to mind is just limit, like do a literal mechanical limitation. Honestly, it's not necessarily a bad solution, but usually it's like the obvious thing is pretty rarely what the best thing to end up going with is, just because there's a lot of options. Yeah, that kind of direction. Like I said, it's not necessarily the best answers here, but what I am a little worried about is them just nerfing Flash and being like, it's all good, because I think he's a little too polarizing in his current form. You do need a couple of cards like that in the game, and you'll point that out, especially people that have kind of like that understand a decent amount of game design will point out something that I haven't really explained, which is that it's not as if certain things shouldn't be in the game at all. Certain things should be limited. And you'll notice that when it comes to a card like War Mother's Call, which is on the list right here, War Mother's Call, you know, I'll put it down, it's polarizing. When it comes to a concept like War Mother's Call, I'm not even really mentioning it. And do you know why that is? It's because the game does need some things like that. Not every card was designed to be competitive. And that's also something that people need to escape the mentality of. I don't think they have really mentioned this in any of their posts yet. I suspect we might see it in the next one, because they mentioned at a certain point that their philosophy was tied with the identity of spreading viability as much as possible. And a high amount of viability is important, but then your game is either going to end up really boring or really imbalanced. And just think about that for a minute. If everything is viable, then your game has to be like either really boring or really imbalanced. Imbalanced being things are viable because things are rock, paper, scissors. It's one of those two things. You can't have a game where everything is viable. It doesn't work like that. So you need a game where certain strategies are balanced at certain levels, and there's certain strategies that should be strong, and there's certain strategies that should be weak. And we can talk about what kinds of things we should have there. And we all kind of, I think, intuitively understand this. We expect to be rewarded for skill. We intuitively understand, not just in card games, but in any game, that the strategies that should be strong are the ones that take a bit more skill. And in general, that's true. There's a couple other criteria for like what should be strong and what should be weak. You want a lot of ideas to exist in the game, but certain things are better off being weak. Deny is a great example of a card that should exist, should never be deleted. It's great, but it should exist in a pretty weak form. And that's where we have it right now. The card is like, I would put Deny in the barely viable category. And that's great. That's perfect. Like, it hits decks, and it's too weak to do too much. That's good. Solid. Great. You know? The most extreme example, again, is going to be Unyielding Spirit, which is, this is a card that its design is good to exist. And it is also simply too toxic. So it needs to be completely gutted. Completely gutted. So, I mean, you can have fun building a deck with it if you want, but reasonably speaking, this just kind of like doesn't really see most of the light of day. Now, you might say, well, Swim, if the card doesn't really see much play, then what's the point? And here's the thing. There's a lot of players that like concepts. If there's a card that gets printed that makes you sit and think for an hour more about different ways to build it, and makes you play it, try it out for even just a day or two, you know, you try a couple of your concepts and maybe they don't work, and maybe you never play the card again, ever. The card did its job. That's what a card is. That's its job. That's all it needs to do. Cards exist to be interesting, even if they aren't really super widespread played, right? And that's super important. Because so many people just think that every card needs to be competitive, and that's just a very, very easily disprovable mentality. Again, think about it for any amount of time. If everything's viable, your game's either unbalanced or boring. I probably 3 times is too many times to say that, but like, there's no other logical conclusion if everything's viable. One of those two states is true. So a lot of interesting cards like to exist at a low power level, and a lot of skill rewarding cards, as well as creating like diverse play experience cards, want to exist at a high power level, right? And that's a pretty big thing to understand. Okay, so given that, you might say, so Swim, you know, the game needs cards like Unyielding Spirit even when they're not competitive. So, you know, we've got cards like War Mothers, and Swim, you're very firm that War Mothers is a garbage card and always has been, never been competitive, never will. And of course, yeah, sure, that's all true. So if a card like War Mothers isn't a problem, then why don't we take Heimerdinger, and instead of making him less polarizing, why don't we just make him kind of like that relegation of cards? Because these types of cards do need to exist. They're important to the game. They are. We don't think about them that much, but they need to exist. The answer is very simple. And this is something that a lot of you guys probably haven't thought of, and he's a champion. Don't do that with champions. Period. Like, this is your IP. People like champions. Champions exist in a different category of other cards because of that, like, sort of like IP or brand loyalty. People are like, oh, the champions are the cards that, yes, these cards should all be viable, or air quotes viable. I mean, depends on how we define viable. So Heimer exists in a form where he's too polarizing. He's a champ, so you don't want him to be super weak. Therefore, the only solution, if you want him to not literally the only solution given those two things is to lower his polarization. That's the only possible solution. Other than that, he will either be too weak or cancerous or relegated to just kind of being like a cute concept card, right? Anyway, that was all a way to explain why I didn't mention that, but that was one potential counter argument that I sort of wanted to just like preemptively, because I didn't give before a reason why reducing polarization was the only solution for Heimerdinger, and that's why I think it is. In the spirit of like different cards existing at different power levels, I want to point out that we need to escape the idea of the full balanced mentality. So a really good thing is like, you know, there's this like derogatory term you guys have probably heard. It's a people just spit this term with fucking venom. They hate these cards. Here's the term: auto include. Nobody likes auto includes. The thing to understand is there's a few cards that are good to be auto includes from a design standpoint. It's a bit of a hard pill to swallow, but like I said, certain things are designed to be staples and high skill and things that are, you know, rewarding to play around, and there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of auto includes to a degree for specific cards. I'm going to give you guys two examples, and those are going to be Single Combat and Glimpse Beyond. Both of these cards are literally staples of their decks. Glimpse, some decks are cutting out Glimpse. In the past, more so in the past, it's been an auto include, but these cards are both really integral to the like identities, as well as incentivizing a ton of very, very diverse and intricate situations. With these two cards, there's so many ways this can play out. There's so many ways. You'd be shocked. Like when you sit and think about all the different lines, right? It's like, you know, my opponent has 2 mana, so he could be on Glimpse. So my Vile Feast, I want to save. I'll wait 2 turns. He did the Glimpse first. I got him. I've got the Vile Feast. Single Combat, you have to think, do they have the double? You know, I could save this for 3 turns for the Radiant Guardian. There is so much to these cards. It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. You can save them as counters. You can use them proactively. You can look at your hand state and realize you have to use them proactively when you have a chance, because you're not going to have the reactive capabilities. You can use them to counter certain effects that rely on targets, like Concussive Palm. These are great cards to be auto includes, right? They're great. They're amazing. And also, it is because they are auto includes. It is necessary. It is because they are auto includes that skill exists. If they weren't auto includes, we wouldn't be able to reliably play around them. It's not just them being cool concepts, so we should see them more often. It is because they are auto includes that we are able to play around them more. So we need to get away from the. Don't get me wrong. These are cherry picked. Like, most cards that are auto includes are actually pretty toxic, right? Don't get me wrong. And here's a problem. There's a couple of cards that the devs put in this lump. I don't mind Mystic Shot, by the way. Mystic Shot shouldn't change. I agree with it being here. Here's the problem, and this card doesn't belong here. Let me be more specific. I'm gonna be more specific. It's not as if you can't say Will of Iona doesn't belong here, but at the very least, at 4 mana, it's kind of ridiculous. And there's a difference between like an auto include 3 of versus something that you kind of have to auto include but might be potentially a 2 of, or depending on the deck, even a 1 of. To be honest, I'm not really sure. I can't say I'm sure how many Will of Ionias we'll see when they nerf it to 5 mana. I suspect it won't be an auto 3 of, but it might still be an auto include to some degree, you know? And it comes down, as always, not to balance. Like, you might say, Disciple is an auto include now that demo exists and it's broken as shit. Disciple's an interesting topic. Precipic was arguing to me last night that Disciple is healthy in a lot of ways, and I'm sort of coming around to it. I need kind of time to process that. I'm not going to touch on Disciple today. Auto includes are important. the biggest problem with this card, Will of Ionia, is the limitation it has on other cards. You know, there's a lot of auto-includes. Why are we singling this one out? I mean, there's, you know, even in Ionia, you've got Shadow Assassin. This is, you know, Shadow Assassin, don't get me wrong. This is a card that's probably too strong and probably pretty awkward, but I can also guarantee you that the meta will be a lot more liberated from a nerf to this card than a nerf to this card. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the play rate, and it doesn't even really have to do with their win rate. It just has to do with the fact that this card invalidates too many different strategies. And that's it. Okay. I mean, you guys know that, like, I am vehemently opposed to Will being a 4-mana card. Okay. Next up.